Have you ever noticed a very specific kind of silence? Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that shows up right after you finally get everything you thought you wanted, and none of it answers back. You hit the number, you get the title, the relationship, the recognition you spent a decade chasing. And then, with no warning and no single event you can point to and blame, the whole thing goes quiet. The achievement just sits there. It does not glow the way you assumed it would. You keep waiting for the feeling you were promised, and the feeling never arrives. Something inside you has quietly started to withdraw its consent. We usually give this a small, manageable name. A rut, a burnout, a midlife wobble, a phase to be pushed through on the way back to normal. But Carl Jung, who spent his career mapping the inside of the human mind more thoroughly than almost anyone before him, argued that what looks like a malfunction is very often the opposite. It is the psyche's most disciplined attempt to rescue you from a life that was never actually yours to begin with. He called the entire mechanism individuation, and unlike self-improvement, it does not ask for your permission before it starts. If what you are living through right now feels less like progress and more like erosion, if the floor you built your identity on has started to feel thin under your feet, here is the uncomfortable comfort. You have not broken. You are on schedule. This is what the psyche does in the months before it rebuilds a person from the studs up, and almost nobody warns you it is coming. So let's go looking for the door together. It is hidden somewhere underneath the version of you that lives on your resume, your dating profile, your family group chat. And Jung's model maps 5 thresholds that a psyche in this state has to cross before anything is finally allowed to click into place. We are going to walk through all 5 in order, and by the end you will know exactly which one you are standing in right now. Here is the part almost no one tells you before you start. Most people who enter this process do not fail because the process is too hard. They fail because they stop one threshold too early, usually right around the 3rd or 4th, at the exact point where everything looks like it is falling apart with no floor in sight. They mistake the demolition for the disaster instead of recognizing it as site preparation. So before we begin, make yourself one promise. Whichever threshold you recognize yourself standing in today, stay with it until the end of this video, not because I am asking you to, because the version of you waiting on the other side of it is asking you to. It is worth being honest about why this particular season tends to arrive when it does. It rarely strikes during an obvious crisis, when the reason for distress is visible to everyone, including you. It tends to strike in the middle of an apparently fine life, a stable job, a functioning relationship, a version of success that would satisfy most reasonable observers, which is exactly what makes it so disorienting. There is no external villain to blame. Nothing catastrophic has to happen first. The psyche does not wait for permission or convenient timing. It simply reaches the point where the gap between the life you are performing and the life that is actually yours has grown too wide to sustain any further, and it starts, without ceremony or negotiation, to close that gap itself. Threshold 1. The mask begins to crack. Have you ever caught yourself snapping at someone you love over something so small it embarrassed you 5 minutes later? Every person who has ever built a stable, functioning identity has done it the same way, by choosing, mostly without noticing, which parts of themselves are acceptable to show and which parts get locked in a back room and never mentioned again. Jung called the show-facing part the persona, borrowing the Latin word for a stage actor's mask. The persona is not fake exactly. It is real, useful, and for most of your life, necessary. It is also, by definition, incomplete. And everything that gets left out of the mask does not disappear. It goes somewhere. Jung named that somewhere the shadow. For years, sometimes for decades, the arrangement works perfectly. The mask goes on in the morning and comes off at night, and the parts locked in the back room stay quiet, because the mask is doing exactly what it was built to do. Then, without asking your permission, small cracks begin to show. Someone who has spent a lifetime being the reliable one suddenly finds themselves furious at being needed. Someone who built an entire identity around staying easygoing catches themselves picking a fight over something that does not matter at all. Someone who has always taken pride in staying composed finds tears arriving at moments that embarrass them for reasons they cannot name. None of this means something has gone wrong. It means the mask has started to thin in exactly the places it was never reinforced. This is usually the first sign people notice, and almost everyone reads it incorrectly. They assume they are regressing, becoming pettier, angrier, less in control than the person they used to be. What is actually happening is closer to the reverse. The parts of you that got left in the back room for the mask's sake have started knocking, not to punish you, to be let back in. Jung put the underlying instruction more precisely than most people manage to. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Notice what that sentence does not say. It does not say the darkness needs to be destroyed, defeated, or disciplined into submission. It says the darkness needs to be seen. That distinction is the entire difference between a person who spends this threshold at war with themselves and a person who gets through it intact. There is a simple diagnostic for this stage, and it costs nothing. Pay attention to what irritates you in other people out of proportion to the actual offense. The co-worker whose confidence makes your jaw tighten for no clear reason. The stranger's arrogance that ruins your whole afternoon. The family member whose laziness makes you want to lecture them for an hour. The observation, echoed by nearly every clinician who has studied projection since, is unglamorous and a little humiliating. The things that provoke us most sharply in other people are, more often than not, unlived, unclaimed pieces of ourselves, reflected back at a safe distance. It is far easier to be furious at someone else's arrogance than to admit you are starving for the confidence to claim your own space. It is far easier to despise someone else's laziness than to admit how much of yourself you have been forcing to perform. The mask itself is rarely a choice made in adulthood. Most people built theirs by the age of 7 or 8, through a process so seamless and so effective that it leaves no memory of construction at all. Only the finished structure, worn so long it stops feeling like clothing and starts feeling like skin. A child who gets praised only for achievement learns correctly that need and vulnerability are the parts to hide. A child raised in a house where anger was dangerous learns to smile through things that should have made them furious. A child who watched a parent reward cheerfulness and punish complaint learns to perform contentment so early and so consistently that by adulthood they may not be able to tell you, with any confidence, what they actually feel about their own life. None of these children chose the mask consciously. They built the only version of themselves that appeared to be safe to love, using the only materials a child has available, whatever earned attention and whatever made the attention stop. This is also why the goal of this threshold was never to eliminate the shadow. Jung was explicit that a person without a shadow is not enlightened. They are shallow, a two-dimensional cutout of a human being, all surface and no depth. The goal was never subtraction. It is integration, teaching the parts of you that got exiled for the sake of the mask how to sit at the same table as the parts that were allowed to stay. If you are in this threshold right now, here is roughly what it looks like from the inside. Old friendships that once felt automatic now take effort you quietly resent giving. A version of politeness you have performed your entire life suddenly feels like it is choking you. You snap at people you love over nothing, and then spend the rest of the day ashamed of how much you meant it. None of this is a character flaw appearing out of nowhere. It is pressure finding the one seam in the mask that was never built to hold. Stay with that discomfort one more moment, because this is where the process either begins for real or stalls again for another 5 years. Most people, the instant they notice the mask cracking, do everything they can to superglue it back together. A new routine, a new relationship, a new distraction, loud enough to drown out the knocking. It works, for a while. But the knocking always resumes, usually at a worse time, usually louder. The only way through this first threshold is the one thing almost nobody wants to do: open the door in the back room and finally look at what has been living there the whole time. There is a cost to maintaining a mask this rigid for this long, and the cost is rarely optional. Researchers who study chronic stress have long noted that the physiological toll of continuously suppressing authentic emotion, of performing calm while feeling terror, performing warmth while feeling nothing at all, shows up eventually in the body, not just the mind. Tight shoulders that no massage seems to fix. Sleep that never quite restores you. A low hum of exhaustion that a vacation does not touch, because the thing that is tired is not your schedule. It is the muscle you have been using to hold the mask in place since childhood, and it has simply never been allowed to rest. That is the first threshold. It rarely announces itself with a crisis. It arrives disguised as irritability, as inexplicable grief at strange hours, as a fight you cannot believe you just had over nothing. But if this is where you are, the door has already started to open. If this first threshold asked you to notice what you had been avoiding, the second threshold asks something much harder of you: to let go of what you had built your entire life on top of. Threshold 2. The ground gives way. Priya had spent 11 years as a trauma nurse before the morning she sat in the hospital parking lot for 40 minutes and could not make herself walk through the doors. Nothing new had happened, no single tragedy, no specific patient, no dramatic breaking point she could point to later and say, that was the moment. She was simply, finally, unable to perform the version of herself that had gotten her out of bed for over a decade. Competent, unshaken, the one everyone else leaned on. She sat in her car and thought, with a kind of detached horror, I don't know who this is supposed to be anymore. This is threshold 2, and it is where the shadow work of the first stage stops being an internal, private discomfort and starts dismantling the external architecture of your actual life. Jung borrowed a term from medieval alchemy to describe it: nigredo, the blackening. Alchemists used the word to describe the first and most necessary stage of transformation, the point at which raw material has to be broken down into something unrecognizable before it can ever become something new. Before gold, there is always ash. What collapses at this threshold is rarely your career, your marriage, or your health in any dramatic, headline-worthy sense. What collapses is something quieter, and in its own way, more disorienting. The internal story that made your life cohere. The achievements are still there. The relationships are still there. But the meaning you had assigned to them, the reason getting up in the morning used to make sense, has gone hollow. the way a tooth can rot from the inside for months before anyone notices from the outside. This is also why Jung never treated nigredo as a failure of character or a sign that something had gone wrong with a person's development. He treated it as evidence that the development was, for the first time, actually happening. A structure has to lose its load-bearing walls before it can be rebuilt around a stronger frame. The alternative, never entering this threshold at all, is not a stable life. It is a life spent maintaining a structure that was condemned decades ago, at greater and greater cost, for longer and longer stretches of borrowed time. If today the things that once organized your identity, your job, your relationship status, your reputation, the role your family has always cast you in, have started to feel like props on a stage you no longer recognize, do not rush to interpret that as proof you are falling apart. It is closer to the opposite. The ego, the part of you responsible for maintaining a coherent, defendable sense of I, has run out of runway trying to defend a structure that no longer fits who you actually are. It is not being destroyed out of cruelty. It is being renovated out of necessity, and renovation always looks like destruction from inside the building. Priya's version of this threshold wore a nurse's badge, but the shape of it is not specific to any one profession. A stay-at-home father who built 11 years of identity around being endlessly patient can hit a morning where he cannot locate one more ounce of patience anywhere in himself. He mistakes the shortage for a personal failure rather than a structure reaching its expiration date. A startup founder who spent a decade being the most relentless person in every room can wake up one day physically unable to perform relentlessness for even one more meeting, and interpret the exhaustion as weakness instead of information. What makes this threshold especially disorienting in the present moment is that almost none of the external scaffolding of modern life is built to accommodate it. Careers reward consistency. Social media rewards a curated, finished-looking version of a person. Even close relationships often unconsciously prefer the reliable, legible version of you to the uncertain one currently under construction. Nobody around you is likely to say, out loud, that it is acceptable for the floor to give way. You are largely on your own to grant yourself that permission. Before we go further into the second threshold, I want to ask something of you directly, because this is usually the exact point in the video where people either lean in or close the tab. If any part of what you just heard landed somewhere real, if some version of "the ground is giving way" describes where you actually are right now, take 15 seconds and like this video before you keep watching. Not for me. It costs you nothing, and it is a small, physical way of telling yourself, I am not going to look away from this one. And if you want to go a step further, drop a single word in the comments. Nigredo. You do not need to explain it. Some of the people reading your comment will understand exactly what you mean without a single extra word. There is a particular kind of grief that shows up at this threshold that almost nobody names correctly because it does not attach to any specific loss. You are not grieving a person. You are not grieving an event. You are grieving a version of yourself, the one who believed the story, who thought the job title or the relationship or the reputation was the whole answer. That version of you does not get to come along to what happens next, and some part of your nervous system knows it, and it is mourning accordingly, even while your calendar looks exactly the same as it did last month. Here is the part that is almost impossible to believe while you are inside it. The collapse is not happening to punish you for the years you spent inside a structure that no longer fit. It is happening because you finally became someone the old structure can no longer contain. Ash is not the opposite of gold. Ash is what gold looks like on the way there. Ask almost anyone who eventually built a life they consider honest and worth living to point to the hardest single season behind it, and an overwhelming number of them will point to something that looked, from the outside, exactly like failure. A quiet resignation nobody understood, a marriage that ended without a villain, a business that closed with no dramatic collapse, just a slow loss of will to keep propping it up. At the time, almost none of it looked like the beginning of anything. It looked like the end. It is only in retrospect, once the new structure has had time to finish rising, that the collapse reveals itself as the demolition it always was. If the first threshold asked you to notice the parts of yourself you had been avoiding, this second threshold asks you to stop defending the identity built to keep you from noticing them in the first place. That is a harder, lonelier task, and it does not resolve quickly. But it is also the exact point at which the unconscious, the vast, submerged majority of who you actually are, stops sending small signals and starts breaking through in earnest. That is where we are going next, and it is, without question, the strangest threshold of the 5. Threshold 3, the flood of the unknown. Have you ever been afraid of your own mind? Not afraid of a thought, afraid of the mind itself, the machine underneath the thoughts, because it has started doing things you did not authorize and cannot switch off. This is where it usually begins. A dream that will not stop repeating, night after night, circling the same unfinished image. A memory you had not touched in 20 years, arriving uninvited in the middle of a grocery store. A stranger's face on the train that undoes you for reasons you cannot locate. Coincidences that stack up faster than chance should allow, until you start to suspect that something underneath the surface of your life has started paying attention to you. If I were to picture what this threshold actually feels like from the inside, I would not picture a storm. I would picture static. The exact moment a television loses its signal and the picture dissolves into visual noise, except the noise is made of every memory, image, and unprocessed feeling you have not had time to deal with in the last 20 years, all arriving at once, all demanding equal attention. Jung did not believe the unconscious was simply a personal basement of forgotten memories, the way earlier psychologists had described it. He believed it was closer to an ocean, one that every human mind draws from and empties into, a shared substrate beneath individual experience that he called the collective unconscious. Most of the time, a healthy set of psychological defenses keeps the boundary between conscious and unconscious relatively clean, the way a filter keeps sediment out of drinking water. At this threshold, for reasons that are still not fully understood even now, that filter thins, and what was always down there starts finding its way up. One person who described this threshold to me told me about dreaming, for 11 consecutive nights, about a house she had lived in until she was 6 years old and had not consciously thought about in over 20 years, a house she was not sure, in her waking life, she could have drawn from memory with any accuracy. Each night the dream added one more room. On the 11th night, the dream simply ended, and so, oddly, did a low-grade anxiety she had been carrying for months, without being able to name its source. She never fully solved what the house meant. She did not need to. Something in her had apparently needed to finish building it, room by room, outside of her waking control, before it was willing to let the anxiety go. Not everything that surfaces in this flood is frightening either. Many people notice, in the same season as the unsettling dreams and the intrusive memories, an unexpected surge of creative energy, ideas that arrive fully formed, a sudden pull toward painting or writing or music with no obvious practical use, an intuition about a decision that turns out, months later, to have been correct in ways logic alone could not have justified. This is the same mechanism running in a more welcome direction. The channel between conscious and unconscious does not open selectively for pain. Once it opens, everything on the other side has a way in, including material that has been waiting, sometimes for decades, to be useful rather than simply loud. Thoughts that used to arrive in order now arrive out of sequence. Emotions surface with no clear trigger and vanish just as fast. Old identities you thought you had outgrown reintroduce themselves at inconvenient moments. The frightened child, the furious teenager, the version of you that got hurt so early you assumed it had been resolved decades ago. It has not been resolved, it has been waiting. Many people panic at this exact point, because it is the first threshold that can genuinely resemble something clinical, something to medicate away rather than move through. That fear is understandable and should never be dismissed. There is a real, meaningful difference between psychological growth and psychological crisis, and if what you are experiencing includes a serious risk to your safety, that is a conversation for a licensed professional, not a video essay. But for the vast majority of people who pass through this threshold, what is happening is not a break from reality. It is an oversupply of reality, arriving faster than the conscious mind's ordinary filing system can process it. So many people mistake this threshold for regression, for going backward, for losing ground they thought they had already gained. What is actually happening is closer to an audit. Every unresolved file the psyche has been storing in the background gets pulled out, one at a time, and set on the desk in front of you, whether or not you asked for the paperwork. At this point in the script, if you are recognizing more of yourself than you expected to, I want to name something directly, the same way I asked you to earlier. You are not required to have this figured out by the end of this video. Nobody does. If you would like a quiet way of marking that you are still here, still with me, comment the single word flood. You will likely see other people in the replies who typed the same word for the same reason, and there is a kind of relief in that which is difficult to manufacture any other way. What ends this threshold is rarely a dramatic insight. It is something much smaller and much stranger. The moment you stop treating every intrusive thought, every strange dream, every wave of unexplained emotion as an emergency to be shut down, and start treating it as information to be read. The flood does not recede because you fought it into submission. It recedes because you finally stopped bailing water long enough to notice what the flood was actually carrying. And what it is carrying, more often than people expect, is not danger. It is everything you disowned in order to become who you thought you were supposed to be, arriving all at once, all together, asking, for the first time in years, to be let back into the room. If the second threshold asked you to stop defending a structure that no longer fit, this third threshold asks something even more disorienting: to stop trusting your own mind as the tidy, reliable narrator you always assumed it was. What comes next is the direct consequence of that flood. It is the threshold where most people, understandably, become afraid they are losing themselves for good. Threshold 4. A stranger in your own skin. Marcus had built 18 years of professional identity around being the most controlled person in any room. Corporate litigation rewards that trait. He had made partner faster than almost anyone at his firm, specifically because he never let anything rattle him, which is why the Tuesday afternoon he walked out of a closing meeting mid-sentence, sat in the stairwell, and could not stop his hands from shaking felt, to him, like evidence of a complete personal failure rather than what it actually was. 2 weeks later, he found himself turning down a case he would have fought for 18 months earlier because the client reminded him of his father, and he no longer had the appetite to represent that kind of certainty. A month after that, alone in his car in a parking garage, he started crying at a song he had heard 100 times without incident, and could not explain to himself why that day was different from the 99 before it. He described the whole period. Later, the only way that made sense to him: I did not recognize the man doing these things. I still don't, some days. Jung had a name for what Marcus was living through, and it is one of his more unsettling ideas. Enantiodromia, the tendency of a psychological position pushed far enough in one direction to eventually convert into its opposite. The controlled become volatile, the endlessly generous become resentful. The lifelong optimist becomes, for a season, someone who cannot locate a single reason for hope. This is not a personality collapsing at random. It is a psyche correcting for decades of overcorrection, swinging hard in the opposite direction because the original position was never sustainable in the first place. It was a performance mistaken for a personality. This is the threshold where the stakes stop being abstract. In the first 3 thresholds, the fear was of falling apart, of losing ground, of a mind that would not behave. Here, the fear sharpens into something much more personal and much harder to say out loud. The fear of betraying yourself. Not the fear of other people's judgment, the much quieter, much heavier fear that you no longer recognize the person making your own decisions, and you are not sure you trust them. The people around you rarely make this threshold easier, not out of malice, but out of understandable confusion. They fell in love with, hired, befriended, or married a particular configuration of you, and that configuration was never fully honest. It could not have been, since it was built, like everyone's persona, to be lovable rather than complete. When the opposite quality starts to surface, the people closest to you often experience it as a betrayal of the agreement they believe they signed. A partner who married your steadiness may take your sudden uncertainty personally. Friends who relied on your generosity may privately resent your first real boundary. A parent who built pride around your ambition may struggle to understand your sudden hunger for rest. None of this makes them wrong to be confused. It only means their confusion is not a reliable measure of whether what is happening inside you is healthy. It usually is. You do not choose this reversal. You do not plan it, rehearse it, or see it coming with enough warning to brace for impact. You simply wake up one day, mid-swing, already partway into becoming someone your past self would not have predicted, and everyone around you, the people who loved the earlier, more predictable version, starts asking, some gently and some not, what happened to you. Here is what almost nobody tells a person going through this threshold, and it is the single most important thing I can offer you if this is where you are. The opposite is not the enemy of who you were. It is the missing half. Jung's entire model of the psyche rests on the idea that a whole person is not a person who mastered one quality and eliminated its opposite. The whole person is the one who can hold both the control and the chaos, the generosity and the boundary, the certainty and the doubt, without needing either one to win permanently. What feels like betrayal in the moment is frequently the psyche's most direct route to that wholeness, because it is the only way to prove to yourself that the opposite quality exists inside you at all. You cannot integrate what you have never been forced to feel. That does not make it comfortable. Marcus did not feel like a man becoming whole. He felt like a man losing the only version of himself he knew how to respect. That gap between what integration actually is and what it feels like while it is happening is exactly why this threshold is the one most people abandon the process at. It is far easier to diagnose yourself as broken and spend the next several years working to rebuild the old, controlled version than it is to sit inside the discomfort of not yet knowing who the new version will be. Marcus, a year later, would describe the period differently than he did while he was living through it. He no longer called it a breakdown. He called it the first time in his adult life he had been forced to find out whether the people around him loved the performance or loved him. And the answer, it turned out, was more complicated and more hopeful than he expected. Some relationships thinned, a few ended, but the ones that survived became, in his words, the first relationships in his life he actually trusted, because they had now been tested against a version of him that was not curated for approval. There is a real risk worth naming honestly at this threshold, because pretending it does not exist would not serve you. Some people get stuck here. Instead of using the swing toward the opposite as information, evidence that the discarded quality needs to be integrated, not enthroned as a replacement identity, they simply trade one incomplete self for another. The lifelong people-pleaser who discovers boundaries can, if they are not careful, spend the next decade mistaking coldness for strength. The rigidly controlled person who finally touches chaos can mistake permanent instability for freedom. Enantiodromia is meant to be a crossing, a temporary and necessary overcorrection on the way to something more spacious than either extreme. It was never meant to be a new place to move in and unpack permanently. The goal on the other side of this threshold is not to become your opposite. It is to become someone large enough to contain both halves without needing either one to run the whole show. If this threshold is where you are right now, here is the only instruction that actually matters. Do not make any permanent decisions from inside it. Do not conclude, from a season of feeling unrecognizable to yourself, that you have discovered your true and final nature at last. This threshold is a crossing, not a destination. The volatility is not who you are becoming. It is the friction of two halves of yourself meeting for the first time in years, and friction, however uncomfortable, is not the same thing as damage. What comes after this threshold is not more escalation. It is, strangely, the opposite, and it is the part of this process almost nobody expects, because it does not look like a resolution at all. It looks, at first, like nothing happening whatsoever. Threshold 5. The hush before the turn. Life does not suddenly become clear. The future does not arrive with an explanation attached. What arrives instead, for most people at this final threshold, is quiet. Not peace exactly, not yet, but a specific, unfamiliar stillness that shows up after the flooding of threshold 3 and the violent swing of threshold 4 have both, finally, run out of force. The dreams stop repeating, the tears stop arriving without warning, and the mood stops swinging between extremes. And into the space that gets left behind moves something that can feel, at first, almost worse than the chaos it replaced. A silence, with no obvious next step written inside it. If I were to picture this final threshold, I would not picture a door swinging open. I would picture the moment right before dawn, when the sky has not yet decided what color it is going to be, and the birds have not yet started, and the whole world seems to be holding still on purpose, waiting for permission to become something. This is, without exaggeration, the threshold that causes the most people to conclude that the process has failed. After the drama of the previous stage, stillness reads as anticlimax. Where is the breakthrough? Where is the moment of clarity every article promised would eventually arrive? Many people spend months in this hush, convinced that their transformation has quietly stalled out somewhere between who they were and who they are supposed to become. That they are stuck in the wreckage rather than standing in a threshold at all. Alchemists had a word for this stage too, the one that follows the blackening of nigredo, albedo, the whitening. Where nigredo is the necessary decomposition, albedo is the washing, the settling, the long quiet interval in which what has been broken down slowly, almost imperceptibly, begins reorganizing itself into something coherent. It is not a passive stage, it only looks passive from the outside, the way a chrysalis looks like nothing is happening to anyone who has not studied what is actually taking place inside it. A body being completely dissolved and rebuilt from cellular material that no longer resembles either what it was or what it is about to become. You are, right now, if this is your threshold, at chrysalis, not broken, not stuck, mid-process, in the one part of the process that offers no visible evidence of progress to the person living through it. Almost nothing in modern life is built to honor a threshold like this one. We live inside a culture that treats stillness as a problem to be optimized away, a symptom to medicate, a productivity gap to close, a mood to fix with the next purchase, the next trip, the next distraction, loud enough to make the quiet stop ringing in your ears. Every instinct trained into you by that culture will tell you to do something about this hush. The instruction this threshold actually requires is the opposite, and it is, for most people, the hardest instruction in this entire video to follow. Do less, not more, and trust that the stillness is not empty just because it is quiet. So many people misread the hush as depression too, and it is worth being careful and precise here, because the two can look nearly identical from a distance and deserve to be told apart. Depression tends to arrive with a flattening, a loss of meaning, a loss of interest, a sense that nothing means anything and nothing will. What shows up in this fifth threshold is different in one crucial respect, even when it feels just as heavy. Underneath the stillness, there is not an absence of meaning. There is too much of it, still settling, not yet sorted into a shape you can name. If what you are experiencing is severe, persistent, or frightening, please do not white-knuckle it alone on the theory that it must be this threshold. Talk to someone qualified to help you tell the difference. But for most people, most of the time, this particular quiet is not the mind shutting down. It is the mind finally clearing enough space to hear itself. There is not much to do in this threshold, and that is precisely the discipline it asks of you. What tends to help is smaller and quieter than people expect, protecting unstructured time instead of filling it, writing without an audience in mind, and spending time in places that do not demand a performance from you. It also means sleeping more than feels productive, and postponing major decisions, the ones about careers, relationships, or moves across the country, until the hush has had enough time to finish its work. This is not the threshold for reinvention projects or 5-year plans. It is closer to convalescence after a long illness, where the most productive thing a body can do is rest long enough for its own repair systems, largely invisible from the outside, to finish what they started. No fixed length exists for this threshold, and that uncertainty is, on its own, one of the hardest parts of enduring it. It can last weeks. For some people, it lasts years. What ends it is rarely a single dramatic event. It is closer to the way winter ends, not with an announcement, but with one morning that is fractionally warmer than the one before it, so gradual you cannot name the exact day it started, only that at some point you look up and notice the season has already changed around you. Recognize this threshold. the flatness that is not quite despair, the waiting that has no scheduled end date, the sense of being suspended between two versions of a life. And here is the only task worth focusing on while you are inside it. Stop demanding the hush, produce a timeline. It will not, and the demand only adds a second layer of suffering on top of a process that was already difficult enough without your impatience added to it. Your only job in this threshold is to not mistake the quiet for the end of the story, and to keep living as ordinarily as you can manage while something underneath the ordinary living finishes reorganizing itself without your supervision. If the fourth threshold asked you to survive becoming a stranger to yourself, this fifth threshold asks something gentler and in its own way harder, to wait, without proof, for a person you have not met yet. In the end, none of this was ever about becoming someone completely different from who you have always been. That was never the goal, and if you take one idea from everything we just walked through, take this one. The point was never to replace yourself. It was to stop being at war with the parts of yourself that the mask was never built to hold. Clarity, when it finally comes, does not arrive as a lightning strike. It arrives the way morning arrives after the kind of night you were not sure would end. Quietly, gradually, until the moment you realize you can see the room again and you are not certain exactly when that became true. The fog does not lift all at once. You simply notice, one ordinary Tuesday, that you can see further than you could the week before. Remember the silence we opened with, the strange, unanswering quiet that showed up right after you got everything you thought you wanted. That silence was never empty. It was the very first knock from the door in the back room, the earliest signal that the mask had started to thin. Everything since has been the long, five-part answer to a question that silence asked you months or years ago. Who are you, underneath the person you built to be seen? You are not broken for having heard that question. You were not broken at the mask cracking, or at the ground giving way, or at the flood, or at becoming, for a season, a stranger to yourself, or at the long hush that followed. Every one of those thresholds was not a sign of a life going wrong. It was a psyche insisting, the only way a psyche knows how, on becoming whole rather than merely comfortable. If you recognized any part of your own story somewhere in this video, I want you to know you are not going through it alone, even though very few people around you may be talking about it. Somewhere in the comments below, right now, there is very likely someone standing in the exact threshold you are standing in. Tell them, and tell yourself, say which threshold you are in, 1 to 5, and nothing else if you would rather not explain. Sometimes the most useful thing another person can offer you is simply proof that the threshold you are standing in has a name, and other people have survived standing in it too. Subscribing to this channel costs you nothing, but it is worth being honest about what it actually represents. It is not really support for the channel. It is a quiet vote for the version of you on the other side of this. A small, private signal that you intend to keep going back for the rest of the map instead of stopping at the threshold that scared you the most. That is all subscribing has ever really meant. If any part of the last several minutes described your life more accurately than you expected it to, that is worth a share too. Not for the algorithm, but because someone you know is probably standing in one of these 5 thresholds right now, silently, with no idea there is a name for what is happening to them. None of the 5 thresholds we just walked through come with a guarantee about how long they will last. No video, including this one, can hand you a schedule that does not exist. What Jung's model offers instead is something more modest and in the end more useful than a timeline. Proof that the road has a shape, that other people have walked it before you, and that the specific, private terror of feeling like you are coming apart has a name and a sequence and, eventually, another side. If you are watching this at 2 in the morning because sleep will not come, or on a lunch break you are pretending is about something else, or after a conversation that left you rattled in a way you have not told anyone about yet, I want you to know this video found you, in some sense, on purpose. Not because of an algorithm, although that is certainly how it arrived in front of you, but because people in the middle of exactly what we have spent this hour describing tend to go looking for language for it, usually late at night, usually alone, usually without telling the people closest to them that they are looking. If that is you tonight, you are further along than you think. Recognizing the shape of a thing is very often the beginning of surviving it. Whatever threshold you are in tonight, you are not malfunctioning and you are not behind schedule. You are exactly where the process needed you to be in order to finish. Thank you for staying with this one until the very end. I will see you in the next threshold.